What game springs to mind when you think of the 1990s? Up first is Dan, who says, I was born in 87, and my first non-Atari game was Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Guess that's mine, with the glorious colors and music. And wow, Dan, going from any of the Atari systems available to Sonic 2 is like going from peanut butter and jelly to a 4-course meal. No shade to Atari, they helped pave the way, but Sonic 2 blazed its own path with blistering fast side-scrolling and some of the finest graphics on the Sega Genesis. Heck, this was blowing past what was going down in the arcade. Nintendo lived to see more console wars than Sega, but don't allow any sort of revisionist history. Sonic was far, far cooler than Mario, and the worldwide launch of Sonic 2 on Sonic Tuesday helped establish the pre-order and release date structure of game sales, which we take for granted. Sonic was the Pepsi to Coke, the Bart Simpson to Dennis the Menace, the physical embodiment of a record scratch, and a 90s icon that's doing pretty darn well for himself over in Hollywood these days. Sonic has had a pretty hit-and-miss success rate, to put it mildly, but there's a very good reason the series evokes memories of Sonic 2 over and over and over again. Firstly, it introduced Tails, the first in a long, often confusing line of friends that inhabit the Sonic universe. Second, the stage design actually fit the speed-based gimmick. Go ahead and play Sonic 1, and every other second you'll be slamming into a wall or narrowly avoiding a pit. Sonic 2 hit the sweet spot of spectacle and skill, allowing players to feel the G's before completing a compelling boss battle sequence. Complicated it is not, but in the era when gamers enjoyed kicking back and playing a game from start to back in one sitting, sometimes a few times a week, Sonic 2 was a quick-hit action fix that left a world of imitators struggling to keep up. Tim says, Ocarina of Time, though I am a Legend of Zelda fan, so of course I think of that game. Good call, Tim. Ocarina of Time was a big deal for Nintendo 64 owners, but something that gets lost in the conversation is the extensive drought between major games. The PlayStation was being flooded with new and original ideas, meanwhile the N64 and its expensive cartridges scared off many third parties. The ones that did make the jump usually fit in line with Nintendo's family-friendly image, so having a big, bold Zelda adventure with horror elements and time travel easily made it one of the most exciting Nintendo 64 games of 1998. And of course, those creative fellows over at Nintendo reinvented the third-person camera in combat with Z-targeting. Ocarina of Time is considered one of the best games of all time and a watershed moment in game design. Up next is Skylar, who gets right to the point, quote, Dino Crisis July 1st, 1999, end quote. And even if it's late in the decade, you're darn right, Skylar, Dino Crisis is absolutely drenched in all the touchstones of the 1990s. First of all, it's clearly trying to be Jurassic Park. Dinosaurs saw a big return in the 1990s thanks to Steven Spielberg directing the highest-grossing movie at its time. But despite some rather fun attempts, none of the officially licensed Jurassic Park games felt like the movie or the book. Meanwhile, Dino Crisis is Resident Evil creator Shinji Mikami taking a Spencer Mansion template and spreading it out to a malfunctioning facility packed with prehistoric carnivores. Dino Crisis certainly didn't reach the same heights as Resident Evil, especially after Part 3 took an ill-advised trip to the stars. But recently, Dino Crisis was included on the PlayStation Plus Premium Classic lineup and is now available for purchase on its own. So of course, fans are already back to begging for a remake or a sequel. Here's hoping that life, finds a way. Up next is Batman GG, who says, either Mario 64 or The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And since we've already chatted Zelda, let's take a look at that classic Mario 64. Now, at the time, people were impressed with the graphics, but the praise wasn't totally universal at first. You see, a lot of Mario's design was about power-ups. Super Mario Bros. Gave us the Flame Flower Mario. Mario 3 gave us Tanuki Suit Mario. Super Mario World gave us Yoshi and Cape Mario. And Mario 64 got rid of all of that in service of 3D design and constrained open worlds. Now, clearly that paid off, as we're still discussing it to this day. But in hindsight, it's still pretty weird to change the entire focus of an action platforming game with power-ups to an exploration 3D game. But man, what a game it is! Nintendo applied their thoughtful world design to a 3D environment, fitting in line with the aesthetics of early polygon-based animations, abstract locations which seem to exist outside of time and space, paintings which ripple like water as Mario pierces through to another world. Even 3 decades later, that feeling of limitless creativity, a world of ideas yet to be refined into a uniform style, is still palpable with its primary color-rich world of Mario 64. And really, no game since has been able to recapture this period, because they're emulating the end product rather than the broader cultural movement of early 3D art. It's no wonder fans have a desire for a Mario 64 follow-up. What they really want is that collage of concepts that can only exist in a certain time and place. But hey, at least we can still go back and play Mario 64. DJ gives us 3 mascot classics: Sonic the Hedgehog on Genesis, Mario 64, and Crash Bandicoot. And younger viewers, picture this. Imagine Marvel and DC are both going to be putting out their tentpole summer movies on the same day, and somehow they both lose to another superhero movie. That's the scenario that Sony walked into, while Sega and Nintendo counter-programmed each other to the point where Nintendo thought the Virtual Boy seemed like a good idea. The PlayStation ushered in the era of cheap CD games with fast 3D technology, but seeing as this was the 1990s, they still needed some sort of mascot. And thankfully, Naughty Dog, yes, the developers behind The Last of Us, were cooking up a 3D Sonic ripoff. No, really, to paraphrase the developers, they called the game Sonic's Butt because of the 3D perspective where you would constantly see the character's back. The first Crash Bandicoot is a fascinating game, and anyone who considers themselves a video game academic will need to give this crazy mammal a spin. At points it enters 2D platforming, and these sections are so awkwardly designed, it's clear the studio's passion was in the 3D sections. And as the trilogy played out, these side-scrolling sections served less as some sort of challenge and more as a brief reprieve from the skillful 3D areas. Crash Bandicoot is the primordial soup of other blockbuster franchises like Jak and Daxter and Uncharted, but the character has existed for several generations more without any connection to Naughty Dog, and so many often forget this early association. Thankfully, Naughty Dog are all too keen to remind everyone, including a touching moment in Uncharted 4 where the characters literally play the first Crash Bandicoot. That's meta. Metal Niner says, I hope I got that right, Duke Nukem 3D, Doom, Quake, Quake 2. Maybe you can tell I'm a first-person shooter guy. Hee hee. And fantastic call. The 1990s birthed a first-person shooter and forever changed the perspective of video games. Now, games have always tried to give the experience of inhabiting another body or object, including first-person games like Night Driver, Battlezone, or Flight Simulator. But id Software and its band of anarchist nerds revolutionized everything in games. No, really, the programming of John Carmack immediately influenced other developers. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew, including John Romero, created worlds and stories around the classic Wolfenstein or invented demons on Mars and Doom. But Duke Nukem 3D was no slouch either. While id were recreating heavy metal album covers, Duke Nukem felt familiar in its locations, like grocery stores, city streets, and movie theaters. Being able to recognize the structure of the environment beyond simple gameplay goals added to the general sense of immersion. And of course, the classic voice acting and liberally borrowed one-liners added an extra layer of personality and humor that ushered in a new generation of presentation. Has it aged well? Well, it depends who you ask. Duke is certainly out of pocket, but he always was. Much like shock jock Howard Stern, it has a transgressive appeal with over-the-top and outrageous statements that have no merit beyond entertainment. So what would Duke Nukem be today? Well, I'd say he'd be much more in line with Deadpool or Hot Fuzz than John Wick. Duke was always meant to be shocking, but he was always meant to be fighting for your right to party. However, you should choose to party. Let's continue this conversation with Stimpco, who says, quote, "It's cheating because of the picture above, but it's Quake for me. Already a Doom fan plus 9 Inch Nails music and sound effects, gloomy atmosphere," end quote. Excellent point, Stimco. As I was just saying, you could practically put any Doom screenshot as cover art for a Megadeth or Metallica album. Video games were very much plugged into music culture back then, and as the early 90s moved from metal to grunge to industrial rock, you could see that transition in video games too. Of course, this goes beyond music and game genre. For instance, Street Fighter 3 is dripping with hip-hop, but these days there's more official collaborations. But it was always exciting to see video games contribute to the overall music culture and vice versa. Now, as for Quake and Quake 2, these are the double barrels of 3D action that completely evaporated the industry of the past. Hyperbole? Well, given how many formative 3D games were developed on the Quake and Quake 2 engine, we're literally still working with the technology John Carmack designed 30 years ago. No wonder he went on to make rocket ships. Recently, Microsoft re-released Quake and Quake 2, and it's allowed players of all ages to rediscover this dark and gritty shooter. And for you pro wrestling fans out there, it is the studio that came up with a little idea called God Mode. Nice try, Dwayne, but we remember Quake. 50 Shades gives us a list. Quote, "I think of Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, Gran Turismo, Final Fantasy VII, and Metal Gear Solid. Mario 64 was the first game I thought of," end quote. Well, let's take a look at some of those PS1 games you just mentioned. Metal Gear Solid was one of the first games to truly reach parity of film techniques inside of a game engine. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy VII took the pre-rendered route, but to great effect, telling a story of environmentalists who attempt to save the world with swords and bullets. Heck, with the remakes, we've never stopped talking about Final Fantasy VII for these 30-odd years. But when it comes to Gran Turismo, the topic of conversation is always the latest and greatest in the series. But this undermines how significant the first game was to the culture of video games. Simulation racing had already been attempted countless times, including franchises like Need for Speed, which quickly abandoned their challenging mechanics for much more accessible and arcadey fun. Other games centered on the act of racing. Gran Turismo focused on the love of the automobile, its history, its tradition, symbology, and legacy. No, the cars couldn't get totaled no matter how many times you slammed into a wall, but that was the cost of getting officially licensed vehicles. And a very fair trade, I'll say so. Back in the 1990s, passing by a CRT monitor, it could be legitimately confusing to see if you were looking at an actual video of a car or a Gran Turismo replay. These days on HD screens, yeah, not so much. You just had to be there. Sidewinder74 says, Gabriel Knight series, end quote. Well, Sidewinder74, I consider myself a bit of a video game expert. And whenever you hear me chatting about games, it's because I already know about them. I've taken the time to learn and research the subject. But Gabriel Knight is an absolute black hole. I've played point-and-click games. I've even gone back and played older point-and-click games. But not once, not one single second of my life have I had the pleasure of experiencing Gabriel Knight. But right now, I'm discovering the titular character is voiced by none other than King Chicken himself, Tim Curry. Well, that's getting added to my playlist as soon as possible. And what's this? His co-star is Mark Hamill? Do you think they talked about how Curry got replaced by Hamill as the Joker on the Batman the Animated Series? Anyway, great shout, Sidewinder74. I guess I got a whole franchise to get to. Up next is Benedict, who says, the first one was Prince, and the next one was some kind of battleship strategic game. The rest are Duke Nukem 3D, Doom, Turok, then came PS1, end quote. And heck, let's keep that list going with Mark. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Sonic the Hedgehog, Mortal Kombat, Earthworm Jim, Super Mario World, Comic Zone, Crash Bandicoot, Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Chex Quest, Duke Nukem, Unreal Tournament. So many more that I'm forgetting, but the 90s were a golden age for gaming. Not too many experimental wacky games coming out these days, end quote. And I gotta agree with Benedict and Mark here. The 1990s were a hodgepodge of technology. There were pixels, early 3D games, early bump mapping, early VR. I guess if you wanted to call the 90s anything in technology, it was too early and too ambitious. But flip it another way, and you're looking at a time when everyone was chasing the cutting edge. We're talking a Zen-like concept that could be found in all tech-based industries at the time. So what exactly was it? Well, the 1990s figured out a lot of stuff for the rest of us. Some things went great, and we remember them. And the other ones didn't, but also helped refine what a proper game experience should be. We've come a long way from when game engines were designed for a single game and then thrown away. And that sort of extravagance can certainly give the allure of a better time. But really, it's just the creators working with the tools they had at the time. The AAA games of today are still chasing that dream. The only thing that's changed are the tools. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. How about continuing the conversation and letting us know what you enjoyed about video games in the 1990s? Hey, it's okay if you weren't even born back then, because video games are forever. So chat back with us in the comments, and we'll see you next time.